Clarabelle lay face down in the scalding sand, her breath shallow and her skin blistering beneath the merciless sun. Her once white dress, now torn and crusted with grit, clung to her trembling body like a funeral shroud, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and despair. The rope burns circling her wrists were no longer just wounds, they were brands of betrayal, crimson and raw, carved by a man who had whispered safety and delivered damnation. Her lips were cracked, her tongue heavy and dry, and each swallow felt like swallowing dust. Time had lost all meaning in the heat. She no longer knew if it had been hours or eternity since she'd screamed herself hoarse, since the desert had swallowed her voice whole. The sun mocked her climbing higher, with every moment casting no shade, no mercy, only the slow burn of death. Vultures circled above, slow and patient, their shadows flickering over her body like omens. She had trusted him. Just 3 hours earlier, Samuel Crenshaw had seemed like salvation. He'd promised her freedom from the suffocating future. Her guardian had arranged a forced marriage to a man thrice her age. Samuel had leaned in close, voice soft as velvet, and said he knew a way out. Clara had followed him because she had no one else to follow. But when they reached the edge of the desert, when the world fell silent, and the horizon offered no witnesses, Samuel changed. His gentle smile froze, his eyes turned flat and reptilian. When she flinched at his touch, he'd snarled like a wounded beast. "You think you're too good for me," he'd hissed, fingers tightening around her arms like manacles. She'd fought, screamed, begged. He'd only laughed. With terrifying calm, he dragged her to a dead mesquite tree, tied her wrists to the brittle trunk, and rode off without looking back. "Let's see how proud you are when the sun finds you," he'd said. Those words echoed now, looping in her mind like a curse. Her voice was gone, her strength spent, her hope crumbling with each passing breath. Alone in a sea of heat and silence, Clara waited for death to finish what Samuel had started. Less than a mile from where Clara clung to life, another soul was being tested by the desert's unforgiving hand. Ayana, war chief of the mountain Apache, rode with blood dripping steadily down his left arm, seeping through the crude wrap of his buckskin shirt. The arrow had struck just before sunrise, one of three that whistled through the air when soldiers from Fort Wallace ambushed his hunting party. No warning, no parley, just steel slicing through dawn air. 3 of his men lay dead in the sand behind him. 2 more had scattered, wounded, and lost. Now he rode alone, driven not by vengeance but by sheer necessity. His horse, a lean chestnut mare bred for endurance, limped beneath him, foam thick around her mouth, her flanks streaked with sweat and sand. Every step was a gamble against collapse. Ayana gritted his teeth, one hand clutching the reins, the other pressing into the ragged hole near his shoulder. He had to find water. The spring he knew hidden between 2 knife-edged rock spires was close if his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. The desert did that. It whispered false promises to dying men, painted illusions on the horizon, offered salvation only to turn it to sand in your mouth. His vision blurred edges fading into white heat and trembling light. Still, he pushed on, scanning the landscape with the instincts of a man who'd spent his life in these lands. Then he saw her. At first, Ayana thought she was a mirage, a pale shape slumped against a dead tree, unmoving, barely distinguishable from the sand that clung to her like death's embrace. But no mirage had breath. No illusion had the slow, trembling rise and fall of life, clinging to the edge. He blinked, tried to dismiss her image as the desert's cruel trick, but something in his gut told him otherwise. He nudged his horse closer, ignoring the fire burning in his shoulder. The closer he rode, the clearer she became. A girl, maybe 17, skin reddened by the sun lips, cracked dark hair tangled with blood and grit. And then he saw the ropes, saw the deep torn skin at her wrists, the betrayal, the pain, the raw imprint of cruelty. His jaw tightened. He had seen this before too many times. His people left to die in shame, their stories buried with them beneath the sand. The girl's eyelids fluttered as he approached her body too weak to move her soul somewhere between surrender and prayer. She looked up at him, eyes wide and wild with thirst and confusion. She was expecting death. Instead, she saw a man, skin bronzed by years of sun hair tied back, but loose from exhaustion, face carved by hardship and duty. Blood stained his chest, but his eyes held clarity, wounded but unyielding. Their gazes met. No words passed. None were needed. He saw something in her he hadn't expected. Not fear, not hatred, but recognition. A quiet, shared ache, the kind born from being betrayed by those meant to protect. He should have kept riding. He had no water to spare, no strength to lose. But Ayana knew the desert's justice. If he left her, the land would claim her by nightfall. And something in her eyes, something quiet and breaking, made him stop. The war chief dismounted slowly, his movements stiff with pain, the desert wind tugging at his cloak. For the first time that day, Clara felt something stir inside her, the faintest flicker of safety. Neither of them knew it yet, but their fates had just entwined under the scorching sky. Ayana knelt beside the girl, wincing as a fresh pulse of pain shot through his wounded shoulder, but his movements remained deliberate and precise. The desert offered no second chances, and there was little room for hesitation when both life and death shared the same breath. He examined the ropes binding her wrists, rough hemp, tightened until they cut flesh. Whoever had done this had meant for her to suffer, not die, quickly. He didn't speak. Instead, he drew a small knife from his belt, its edge worn but sharp, and slipped it gently between her skin and the binding. Clara flinched at the touch, her eyes searching his face for cruelty. She found none, only resolve. His hands were careful, his grip steady, each movement, respectful, almost reverent, as if undoing the rope was more than an act of mercy, but a declaration, "You are not forgotten." As the final cord fell away, Clara's arms slumped to her sides like wilted branches, and she gasped more from disbelief than pain. Ayana offered her water from a small leather pouch, lifting it to her lips without speaking. She drank greedily at first, then slower, more mindful. Even through the haze of heat and exhaustion, her eyes never left his. She expected him to ask something, demand something like Samuel had, but he only waited, watching her with the wary patience of someone who had lived long among enemies. When she finally whispered, "Why are you helping me?" her voice was barely audible, dry as the sand around them. Ayana paused, then spoke in clear, deliberate English, because no one else did. It was not pity. It was recognition. In that moment, Clara understood that he knew what it was to be left behind, to be hunted, abandoned, mocked by those who called themselves civilized. His people had lived with such cruelty for generations, and now, without words, he had folded her pain into his own. The moment shattered like glass under hoofbeats. Ayana's head snapped up, nostrils flaring, ears tuned to vibrations in the sand long before Clara could hear them. Horses, several, fast, from the direction of town. His eyes darkened as he scanned the horizon. Clara followed his gaze, already trembling again. In the distance, 3 riders emerged through the heat shimmer, Samuel Crenshaw at the front, flanked by 2 others she recognized with a sick jolt, Marcus Webb, a drunk with more hate than sense, and Dutch Kellerman, whose reputation for Apache cruelty was well known even among children. The 3 men slowed as they approached, forming a half-circle with calculated ease. Their rifles remained holstered for now, but their eyes glinted with menace. Ayana placed himself between Clara and the threat, shielding her with nothing but his body and his calm. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Clara tried. Her legs gave out beneath her, the effort sending stars across her vision. Ayana didn't hesitate. With a grunt of pain, he lifted her into his arms, careful not to press too hard against her bruises. The movement sent fire lancing through his shoulder, but he bore it without complaint. Clara felt the strength in him, the steady rhythm of his breath, the grounding presence of someone who had chosen to protect her, without expecting anything in return. 3 riders, Ayana muttered, eyes narrowing. They see us. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly who they were and what story Samuel would tell. They'll kill you, she whispered. Samuel told them I was kidnapped. They'll say you attacked me. No one will listen to the truth. Ayana's silence was heavy, layered with understanding. He'd lived long enough to recognize the script before it was spoken. The look in the rider's eyes wasn't justice, it was bloodlust. They wanted an excuse, and Samuel had given them one. The desert had just become a battlefield, and survival no longer belonged to strength alone. It belonged to the truth they could prove, and to the courage they could muster before the first gun was drawn. Samuel Crenshaw pulled his horse to a slow halt, his face shaded by the brim of his hat, but Clara didn't need to see his eyes to know what lurked beneath. That smile, crooked, smug, ice-cold, curled at the corners of his lips like a snake basking in heat. Beside him, Marcus and Dutch kept their hands near their weapons, resting easy but ready, exuding the casual menace of men who thought the law wore their face. "Well, well," Samuel called out, his voice clear and theatrical in the still desert air. "Looks like we found ourselves an Indian trying to steal white women. That's a hanging offense where I come from." Ayana said nothing. His hands remained visible, resting away from the knife at his belt, but Clara could feel the tension humming through him like a taut bowstring. He was calculating distance speed, the rhythm of breath, and violence. Marcus spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ain't stolen, huh? Look at her. Dress all torn, scared out of her mind. Apache probably had his way with her already." Clara flinched, not from shame but from fury. That these men could look at her and see only weakness, only something ruined and used, filled her with a heat more unbearable than the sun. "That's not true," she said, voice raw but loud. "He saved me. Samuel, tell them what you did." Samuel's laugh cut through her like broken glass. "Poor thing's been in the sun too long, doesn't know what she's saying. Everyone knows you can't trust what a woman says after she's been through trauma." Dutch nodded solemnly, the hypocrisy thick in his silence. Terrible what savages do to Christian girls. Putting her out of her misery might be a mercy. Clara turned pale. These men weren't just planning to kill Ayana. They were laying the groundwork to murder her, too. Frame it as justice. Tell the world they'd found her abused and broken. No one would ask questions about a girl like her, an orphan, unwanted, invisible. "You're lying," she said, but her voice quivered with powerlessness. Samuel's smirk widened. "Who's gonna believe a girl like you? No family, no name that matters, no value." Ayana shifted slightly, placing himself more firmly between her and the 3 men. She felt the brush of his hand against hers, steady, deliberate. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow, the kind that didn't need words. "The girl speaks the truth," Ayana said quietly, his English careful, clear. "I found her tied to a tree. She was left to die." Samuel's expression darkened. "You calling me a liar?" Chief Ayana's gaze didn't waver. "I call you what you are." The moment held. The desert seemed to still, even the breeze falling silent as tension thickened in the air like smoke before fire. Clara's heart pounded. She could taste metal at the back of her tongue, fear mixed with fury. Samuel slid off his horse with exaggerated calm, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Tell you what," he said, eyes gleaming. "You let the girl go. Ride out of here peaceful-like. Maybe we let you live. She comes with us. We take her back to town where she belongs. Everyone wins." Ayana didn't move. His body remained still, but Clara felt the rage rise in him, like heat rising off stone. They both knew what taking her back to town meant. Samuel would twist the story claim rescue wrap her in shame and silence, and no one would stop him. "The girl stays with me," Ayanna said. Samuel chuckled. "Well, now ain't that interesting? Apache Chief getting sweet on a white girl makes a man wonder what other crimes you been up to." Dutch and Marcus began to spread out, widening the semicircle, closing off escape. Their horses snorted nervously, picking up on the rising energy. Clara knew this wasn't posturing. This was the last breath before violence. She opened her mouth, ready to beg Ayanna to run, to leave her behind and save himself. But before she could speak, the crack of a rifle split the air like lightning. The bullet slammed into the dirt between the horses, sending them rearing eyes wild. Everyone spun, weapons drawn, searching for the source. On a rocky ridge 50 yards away, a lone figure stood silhouetted against the sun, rifle raised, cloak fluttering like a banner in the wind. Clara caught the gleam of beads on his chest and the unmistakable profile of a war-painted face. Ayanna's lips curled into a faint smile. "Nalnish," he called in Apache. "Brother." The figure on the ridge did not move immediately, but his presence shifted everything. In an instant, the desert no longer belonged to Samuel and his men. It belonged to the Apache. Nalnish stood tall, framed by the shimmering heat and the bleeding sky, his rifle steady in his arms, his stance unmistakably that of a man prepared to kill if given reason. Clara watched Samuel's face lose its color. What had once been smug arrogance turned to cold calculation, then flickered into something dangerously close to panic. Samuel had expected to intimidate a lone wounded Apache. He had not counted on reinforcements. Is that a war party?" Dutch murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. "How many more you think are up there?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, suddenly unsure of everything. "But I don't like it." Ayanna spoke calmly, voice carrying across the sand, as if the wind had been waiting to serve him. He called to his brother in Apache, his tone composed, but edged with steel. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. She could feel their weight, the gravity of each syllable. This wasn't a reunion, it was a conversation between warriors, one bleeding the other, watching from a height, assessing the battlefield with a soldier's eyes. The distance between them didn't matter. In the language of the Apache, meaning was carved into every breath. Nalnish raised his hand, replying in kind. His voice was firm, loud enough for even the white men below to catch its cadence, though they couldn't grasp its meaning. Still, something about it made Samuel's fingers twitch toward his pistol. Clara's eyes darted between the brothers. Ayanna had not moved since the shot had been fired, but she could sense the coiled power within him. He was not bluffing. If they attacked now, there would be no hesitation. Blood would stain the sand before the sun reached its peak. "What's he saying?" Marcus asked, beads of sweat forming beneath his hat. Ayanna didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on Samuel, unblinking, patient, predatory. Then he spoke, voice low and resonant. "I told my brother that these men left a young woman to die in the desert, that one of them tried to force himself on her when she refused him." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his hip. "That's a damn lie, I told him." Ayanna continued undeterred that this man tied her to a tree and left her for the vultures because she would not submit. Nalnish's voice rang out again. Clara didn't know the words, but she recognized the tone fury restrained only by respect for his brother's command. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. Ayanna looked at her, something fierce and tender in his eyes. "He said that among our people, men who abuse women are not considered men at all. They are considered animals, and animals are hunted." The rifle on the ridge adjusted its aim. Samuel's horse shifted uneasily beneath him. Marcus and Dutch began to back their mounts away, the illusion of control slipping through their hands like dust. Now wait just a minute, Samuel sputtered. You can't believe the word of some hysterical girl over mine. Ayanna turned to Clara, speaking softly. Clarabelle, show them your wrists. Clara hesitated, but then she remembered what it felt like to hang there, her skin tearing her throat raw, her hope dying under the sun. With trembling hands, she raised her arms, revealing the red raw bands that circled her wrists like bloody bracelets. Marcus swore under his breath. Dutch looked away, jaw clenched. Those could have come from anywhere, Samuel said weakly, but even he heard the hollowness in his voice. Ayanna's voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for Clara. Remove your shirt, he said gently. Her eyes widened. I I can't, trust me, he said, his voice quiet but unflinching. With trembling fingers, Clara pulled aside the tattered dress at her shoulders. Gasps broke the silence. The bruises on her arms, the scratches across her back, finger-shaped, undeniable, glared like bruised truths beneath the light. The evidence wasn't just spoken anymore. It was painted across her skin in a language even the most ignorant couldn't deny. Marcus shifted in his saddle. Jesus, Sam, he muttered. What the hell did you do? Samuel's mask cracked. She's nothing, an orphan. No family. No one who gives a damn. What's one less mouth to feed? She'd have died anyway, at least. This way she was useful. A rifle cracked. The bullet struck so close to Samuel's head, it singed the brim of his hat. His horse screamed and reared. Samuel nearly fell. Nalnish didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. Ayanna's voice carried across the standoff with cold precision. Next shot will not miss. Samuel's horse was still trembling beneath him, the scent of powder hanging thick in the air when Clara stepped forward. Her legs were steadier now. Not strong, not yet, but rooted by something deeper than muscle, by rage, by memory, by the refusal to be silent. Ayanna watched her closely, prepared to shield her if the world turned violent again. But he didn't move. He let her speak. I want him to know what it feels like, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. The three riders stared at her, unsure of what she meant. Samuel laughed short and sharp, though it sounded more like a bark of desperation. You're not going to kill me. You don't have it in you. Clara didn't even blink. She looked at Ayanna, her tone clear. Tie him to that tree. The same way he tied me. Let him feel the sun. Let him know thirst. Let him understand what he tried to do to me. The request fell like a stone into silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dutch frowned uneasy. They hadn't come for this. They hadn't expected justice to be served, not with bullets, but with poetic cruelty. Now, hold on, Dutch finally said. We can't just leave a white man tied up for the vultures. Clara turned to him slowly, the bruises on her skin visible with every movement. Why not? He left a white woman tied up for them. What makes his life worth more than mine? The question landed hard. It wasn't just for Dutch or Marcus. It was for the world that had treated her like an inconvenience, a possession, a disposable body. The Apache warrior on the ridge hadn't moved, but Clara could feel his attention sharpen, as if weighing her words against a code older than the town she came from. Ayanna looked toward his brother and spoke again in their language, brief but firm. Nalnish answered with a single sentence. Ayanna nodded, then turned to the white men. Nalnish says 3 more of our people are coming. They will be here soon. You have until then to decide what justice looks like. Samuel's face turned gray. You can't do this, he stammered. I have rights. I'm a citizen. I own land. You have what you gave me, Clara interrupted. Nothing. The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any knife. Everything he had tried to use against her status property power collapsed in the face of her survival. He was alone now, wounded, exposed, and outnumbered. Clara had faced the sun with nothing and come back alive. Samuel, for all his bluster, had never known powerlessness until this moment. "Please," he said, the words sour on his tongue. "I'll make it right. I'll tell everyone what really happened. I'll—" "You'll what?" Clara asked, stepping closer, fury burning beneath her calm. "You'll tell them you tried to rape an orphan and left her to die when she fought back. You think anyone will punish you for that? You think anyone cares?" Samuel didn't answer. He couldn't. They both knew the truth. In the world they had come from, no one would have blinked if she'd vanished into the desert. But this wasn't that world anymore. Clara turned to Marcus and Dutch. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" Marcus looked stunned. "What do you want from us?" Clara studied them both, then answered without hesitation. "I want you to ride back to town. Tell them exactly what you saw here. Tell them Samuel Crenshaw confessed, that he tried to kill me when I refused him, that I got away and saved myself." Dutch frowned. "And then what? Then you forget you ever saw me alive." The implications hung heavy in the heat. She wasn't just demanding justice. She was rewriting the ending. She was walking away from the world that had tried to bury her and taking her power with her. The conversation fractured beneath the sound of thunder hoofbeats again, but this time deeper, more numerous. Clara turned toward the horizon just as Ayana's head snapped to the east, his expression turning grim. From behind the hills, a cloud of dust rose steadily, accompanied by the growing clatter of steel and leather. More riders, organized, armed. Not bounty hunters or vigilantes, this was military, cavalry. Clara's blood ran cold. Samuel's voice cracked through the silence, tinged with triumph. "Told the sheriff where I was going. Told him I might need backup if I ran into trouble with hostiles." He grinned through the pain of his wounded wrist, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a trap about to spring. "Guess this just became a rescue mission." Ayana's jaw tightened. Nalnish called down in Apache sharp and quick. Ayana replied with equal urgency. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she knew what they meant. They were out of time. The soldiers would arrive in minutes, and when they saw a white girl beside an Apache chief with a man like Samuel bleeding in the sand, they would draw conclusions the way white men always did, through fear, not fact. Ayana moved toward his horse, but Clara grabbed his hand, voice urgent. "You have to go." "No." His refusal was immediate, visceral. "I will not leave you." "You have to," she insisted, eyes burning. "If you stay, they'll shoot you before you can speak." "This was always about survival, Ayana. That's what you taught me. Survive first. Tell the story later." He searched her face, as if willing her to take the words back. But Clara didn't flinch. She'd made peace with this. She'd been powerless before, but now she chose her own danger. "I'll tell them you attacked me, that I escaped, that I took your gun. They'll believe me because I'm white, because I'm a woman, because it fits the story they expect to hear." Ayana didn't argue again. He simply stared at her like she was the fiercest creature he'd ever known. Nalnish shouted from the ridge, urgency now thick in his voice. Ayana turned to go, but Clara reached for his arm one last time. "Tell me something," she said. "What does my name mean?" "In your language." Ayana paused, his gaze softening with a sadness so deep it seemed carved from stone. "Clarabelle," he said quietly. "It means clear water in the desert. It means hope where none should exist." The sound of the cavalry was deafening now. Clara watched as Ayana swung into his saddle. With Nalnish's help, his wound reopened and bleeding freely. The Apache warriors vanished into the rock formations like ghosts, their retreat silent but resolute. She was alone again. But this time it was by choice. She knelt beside Samuel's dropped revolver, checking the cylinder. 4 bullets. Her hands trembled only slightly as she picked it up. She stood and pressed the barrel against Samuel's temple just as the first cavalry troopers appeared over the ridge. The lead rider, a grizzled sergeant named McKinnon, reined in hard, his eyes scanning the scene with trained suspicion. Behind him, a dozen men rode in staggered formation, their rifles ready. "Help!" Clara shouted, her voice breaking from exhaustion, but unmistakably human female desperate. "This man, he tried to kill me. I managed to escape, took his gun. He's hurt, but dangerous." McKinnon held up a hand, signaling his men to hold. He dismounted slowly, his eyes flicking from Clara to Samuel, then to the blood-stained sand. "You all right?" Miss Clara nodded, tears streaking down her dust-covered face. "They weren't fake, but they were timed. He tied me up, left me to die, said no one would miss me." Samuel groaned, his hands still bound, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She's lying," he croaked. "The Apache, they were here. They attacked me. Clara jammed the revolver tighter against his head. "One word," she hissed, "and I'll finish what you started." McKinnon stepped closer, carefully taking the weapon from her hand. "Easy now. You're safe." Two troopers dismounted and hauled Samuel to his feet. He was still muttering about savages, about being framed, but no one listened. Not with Clara standing there, bruised, shaking, clutching the torn remnants of her dress, blood drying on her shoulders, rope burns visible like chains. "What's your name, miss?" the sergeant asked. "Clarabelle," she said. "No family, no one waiting for me." He offered to help me find work in the next town. Instead, he tried to... Her voice faltered. She let it. McKinnon's face darkened. "Bastard." Clara didn't look back toward the rocks. She didn't need to. She knew Ayanna was gone. For now. But part of her had gone with him. 3 days later, the dusty saloon that had been hastily converted into a courthouse fell silent as Judge Horace Harrison entered his black robes, trailing behind him like thunderclouds on the horizon. Clara sat in the front row, flanked by the town's 2 matrons, who had insisted she stay under their care until the trial was done. But it wasn't their presence she felt most, rather the absence of the one man who had stood between her and death. Ayanna's shadow lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Samuel Crenshaw sat at the defense table, his wrist heavily bandaged, his eyes hollow, haunted not by guilt but by the collapse of the world he believed was his by birthright. His lawyer, a slick-tongued Easterner named Carlton Page, paced like a showman determined to rewrite the past with well-chosen words and selective outrage. "My client Page," intoned, "is a respected landowner, a God-fearing man, a man who was ambushed by hostiles and manipulated by a traumatized young woman into taking the blame for something he did not do." Clara didn't flinch. She sat upright, back straight, eyes forward. She had faced the desert. She had stood before rifles. She would not be undone by polished lies. The prosecutor, a local man named Everett Miles, didn't rely on poetry. He called witnesses. He presented evidence. And most of all, he let Clara speak. Her testimony was quiet but unwavering. She described how Samuel had offered her freedom, then tried to steal it. How he'd bound her to a tree like an offering to the sun. She didn't embellish. She didn't cry. But the rope burns on her wrists, still raw beneath her sleeves, did the weeping for her. Then came Marcus and Dutch. They testified reluctantly, the weight of their own guilt pressing down like a yoke. They admitted they'd ridden with Samuel, that they found him wounded, that Clara was holding his gun. They avoided mention of the Apache honoring the request Ayanna had whispered before disappearing into the rocks. But their unease was evident. These were not men standing in the light of truth. They were crawling away from the shadows of their own shame. And the court saw it. The townspeople who just a week earlier wouldn't have noticed Clara on the street now watched her with something like reverence. She had survived what few could, not just the cruelty of one man, but the indifference of an entire world. On the third afternoon, the sun cast long bars of amber light across the room as Judge Harrison delivered his verdict. His voice was heavy with finality. The evidence suggests he said that Miss Clarabelle defended herself against an attempted assault. Mr. Crenshaw, you are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Samuel screamed, wild-eyed spittle flying from his lips as he was dragged away, still proclaiming his innocence. Savages, he howled. They tricked her. She's lying. You're all fools, but his words fell flat as empty as the noose waiting to receive him. Clara didn't watch him go. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating slow and steady. She felt no victory, no joy. Justice, such as it was, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like closing a wound without healing the scar. Later, people would treat her differently, with awkward kindness, with cautious respect. The hotel owner offered her a job. The dressmaker offered to teach her a trade. For the first time in her life, Clara had options. But every night she found herself walking to the edge of town, staring into the vast emptiness of the desert, where wind whispered through rocks and heat still clung to memory. The townsfolk believed she was haunted by trauma. They didn't understand. She wasn't looking back. She was listening, listening for the sound of hooves, for a shadow moving across the sand that meant something more than survival, something like belonging. In the days following the trial, Clara became something of a quiet legend in the town. Mothers whispered her name when speaking of strength. Young girls glanced her way with wide eyes and hidden questions, and the men, those who once wouldn't have noticed her, now stepped aside when she passed, but their respect felt hollow. It was the kind given to survivors, not equals, offered in pity or guilt, not admiration. The hotelier gave her a small room and offered work in the kitchen. The dressmaker spoke of apprenticeships and a respectable future. Even the preacher who'd once called her guardian a man of upright Christian principle now avoided her eyes when they passed in the street. Clara moved through these new offers like a ghost trying on clothes that didn't fit. She smiled, she thanked them, she performed the role of the grateful girl. But each night her steps returned to the edge of town. There beneath the stars she listened, not for danger, but for hooves, for breath, for the low murmur of a voice that had once whispered her name like it meant something. Then 2 weeks after the hanging, she heard it. A single horse moving slow, cautious. Clara rose from her cot without hesitation, heart pounding, not from fear but from a kind of wild hope she hadn't felt since before the betrayal. She stepped out into the cool night, the town hushed behind her. At the border where packed earth met untamed sand, he waited. Ayanna sat astride his horse, thinner but strong. Again the wound on his shoulder healed to a scar that gleamed in the moonlight. He looked at her with the same calm intensity he had worn from the beginning. But now there was something else in his eyes. A question, an invitation, a promise unspoken. "You came back," Clara whispered. Ayanna nodded. "I said you would always have a place with my people. I meant it." Behind her, the town offered safety, stability, and a life half-lived. Before her stood the unknown, wild and hard, but honest. "If I come with you," she said, "there's no going back. Your people and mine will always be enemies," Ayanna finished. "Not always," he added. "Perhaps one day when others see what I see in you, they'll understand that strength has no color, that courage belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it." Clara stared at him, at the moonlight catching in the braids of his dark hair, at the quiet reverence with which he watched her, not like something fragile, but something sacred. She thought of the girl she'd been beneath, that dead tree dying in the sun. That girl was gone, burned away. What remained was someone forged from fire and fury and the memory of kindness in a stranger's hands. "Will you teach me your language?" she asked. Ayanna's smile, faint and rare, was answer enough. He extended his hand, and Clara took it. He pulled her onto his horse, steadying her as she slid behind him, her arms settling around his waist, not from fear but belonging. Together they rode out into the night, the stars above them as witnesses. Behind them, the town slept peacefully, never knowing that one of their own was choosing exile not out of shame, but as an act of defiance. As they disappeared into the vastness of the desert, neither Ayana nor Clara noticed the figure that watched from the shadows behind the blacksmith's shop. A man hunched low, eyes glinting beneath a travel-worn hat. He watched them ride into darkness, silent and unmoving. And then slowly he turned away and followed. Because this story his was far from over. The desert did not welcome Clara with open arms, it tested her. It stripped away every comfort she had known, every illusion of fragility, and demanded she earn her place with sweat and silence. The Apache did not accept outsiders easily. Trust was not given for pity or for novelty, and certainly not for romance. But Ayana had spoken for her, and that was the only reason they let her stay. The women watched her like hawks, stern measuring, waiting to see whether she would fold under the weight of survival. Clara did not fold. She woke with the sun and learned how to grind maize between stones until her hands blistered. She learned to read wind patterns in the sand and track the subtle sign of rabbit trails. She fell twice while helping gather wood, from the cliffs tore her dress bled, and got back up without complaint. The first time an older woman offered her a skin of water, it was not with affection but respect. A small nod of acknowledgement that she wasn't just surviving, she was choosing to belong. Ayana watched her transformation quietly. He never hovered, never instructed unless she asked. But in the evenings, when the firelight painted gold on his face and the children gathered near to hear stories, Clara would sit beside him, her fingers brushing his as they shared a bowl of roasted corn. He taught her words in his language, simple things at first: water, sky, fire, heart. She repeated them with care, shaping the syllables like sacred sounds. One night, under a canopy of stars so vast it made the world feel like a whisper, he placed his hand over hers and asked in his native tongue if she would marry him in the way of his people. There were no rings, no vows before an altar, only fire night and two souls agreeing to carry each other through the hard places. Clara said yes, and when the tribal elders blessed their union, it was not as a favor to Ayana, but because they had come to see Clara for who she had become, not a rescued victim, not a charity case, but a woman with desert dust in her blood and steel beneath her scars. The council fire hissed as a log split open, scattering embers into the wind. Clara stood stiffly beside Ayana, her arms folded, heart pounding, as Marcus Webb explained what should have been impossible. Samuel Crenshaw had not swung from the gallows as everyone had believed. He had help. Marcus said, his voice tight with remorse. People with money, with power. They faked it, staged a botched escape, and claimed he was shot trying to flee. But he's alive. The elders exchanged grim glances. Ayana's expression didn't change, but the sharpness in his eyes turned deadly. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because I owe her," Marcus answered, nodding toward Clara. "Because I was there when he tied her to that tree. I stood by and let him do it. I've had 6 months of dreams to pay for that." Clara stared at him, uncertain whether to feel anger or gratitude. And now she asked. "He's raising a force," Marcus said. "Calls them the Desert Rangers, 40, maybe 50 men, mostly ex-soldiers, bounty hunters. They're calling it a civilization patrol, saying you and Ayana kidnapped a white woman and are planning raids on settlements." Ayana's jaw tensed. "When do they move?" "Soon," Marcus said. "Within days. He knows where your camp is. He knows your warriors are scattered on the hunt. He's planning to strike at dawn." The news hit the camp like a thunderclap. Drums were beaten. Runners were sent to nearby bands. Women began moving the elderly and the children to the cliffs above. The warriors prepared their weapons, but they all knew the truth. Against 50 armed trained men with rifles and horses, even the fiercest Apache couldn't win in a frontal assault. Clara felt the weight of it all pressing into her ribs. "He's doing this for me," she whispered, "because I walked away, because I chose life over him." Ayana touched her shoulder. "You are not to blame for his madness. But I brought this to your people," she said. "If I went to him, surrendered." "No," Ayana said, voice like steel. "I will not offer my wife in place of peace. We fight together. Or not at all." The word wife had never felt so heavy or so sacred. Clara swallowed the rising fear. She was no longer the girl tied to a tree. "Then we fight." Ayana nodded once. It was settled. But Marcus wasn't finished. He doesn't know everything he said. There are men, Dutch, and 3 others who rode with him once. They've turned, like me. They've seen what he is now. We've been watching. We'll help when the time comes. Clara's breath caught. There was still hope, thin, fragile, but real. "Then we use what we have," she said. "We make them come to us. We make them underestimate us. They expect fear. Let's give them fire." That night, Clara sat before the fire while Ayana and his captains carved plans into the sand-false trails, flanking Rotes the use of terrain as defense. She would fight not as a burden, but as a warrior. She sharpened her own knife, loaded a rifle, plaited her hair with feathers gifted by the women who once doubted her. She had earned her place in this circle of warriors, not by blood, but by choice, by fire. Dawn loomed like a held breath. The hills cast long shadows, and the air pulsed with coming war. Clara stood beside Ayana, wearing buckskin, her face streaked with ash. She looked nothing like the broken girl Samuel had tried to erase. She was the storm he had created and would now have to face. Somewhere beyond the ridge he rode with men, convinced of their righteousness. Men who had been told she was a symbol of purity, stolen by savages. But Clara knew better. She was not a symbol, not a trophy, not a victim. She was herself made whole by pain, shaped by choice, and strengthened by the love of a man her people had called enemy. As the first riders crested the hill, Clara whispered the Apache word for truth under her breath. Ayana took her hand. They stood together not just as husband and wife, but as equals, as leaders, as the living defiance of everything Samuel had stood for. This would not be a battle for land or even vengeance. It would be a battle for the right to exist, for the right to love across borders, to live without chains, to refuse the stories written by other men's fears. And Clara Clearwater in the desert was ready to fight. To be continued. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. The next chapter will test everything they've fought for when the enemy brings fire and the desert answers with fury. Click the next video to witness the war that began with a whisper and ended with a reckoning.